Motivation is a very important thing in games, and consideration for game design. But what motivates us? Motivation can be divided into two camps: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation means a reward is coming from within, and extrinsic motivation means a reward is coming from an external source. Now, that's probably still confusing, so let's go deeper and start with extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is rewards that don't come from within yourself, such as getting a promotion at your job or getting some money. The best example outside of games would be a job. You go to work for hours every day for money. Pretty simple. But in games, it gets a bit more complicated, as extrinsic rewards don't have an effect in the real world. Some examples in games can be doing a quest for XP or rewards, or grinding a challenge for a new skin or item. My favorite example of extrinsic motivation is logistics in Foxhole, but we will go into more detail on that later. Extrinsic motivation is important in driving a player to do something the designer wants. A designer can also make intrinsic motivation and do the same thing if done right, but is much less explicit than a quest saying do X and Y, and thus not as effective. Extrinsic motivation can be harmful in games though. It should be used in moderation and with care, as it can hurt motivation as well. We will go into more detail here in a bit, but for now, let's move on to an intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is rewards that come from within yourself, such as feeling fulfillment in doing something or having fun doing it. Intrinsic motivation can be summed up as because you want to. The best example outside of games would be making and tending to a garden or any other hobby. Some examples of intrinsic motivation in games can be making a good-looking house in Minecraft, or exploring new places in Subnautica. You can argue that the last one can be an extrinsic motivator as well, and that's something that we'll go into here in a bit. Intrinsic motivation is important in helping the player have fun and fulfillment while playing a game. It is much better at driving fun as the player has a desire to do things in the game, rather than an incentive as with extrinsic motivation. Now, let's compare intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. But first we gotta understand something. The two sides of motivation are a gradient. Motivation is not one or the other. An example of this can be reaching high levels in Call of Duty Cold War Zombie mode. The higher level you reach, the better the in-game rewards, which is extrinsic. But you may also want to reach the highest level you can for personal achievement, which is intrinsic. The same motivation can be a mix of the two. One can be more motivating than the other, differing from person to person. Now, to compare intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is a much better driver of fun and fulfillment in games. This is because of how intrinsic motivation works. You do it because you want to, not because you want something, but you want to do the action itself for whatever personal reason or satisfaction. I think this is because intrinsic motivation is a desire, while extrinsic motivation is an incentive. You'll do something as long as you want when it's a desire, but when it's an incentive, it feels more like work, and thus if it's too much work, you'll just stop. That brings us to a study that was done on both types of motivation. In this study, there were two sets of kids who were given 1 hour of free time before school. One of the activities they could do was draw, but all the selected students had a high interest in drawing, so that they had an intrinsic motivation to do it already. Group 1 was told that they would be given a reward for their drawings after the study. Group 2 was let free in class, with no mention that the other group had gotten a reward. 2 weeks later, they repeated the study to see what the long-term effects on motivation were for the two groups when there was no reward offered for either this time. The group with a reward given at the end, but not this time, showed less interest in class afterwards and was about half as interested in drawing. While the other group, who didn't get rewarded either time, had the same engagement level and quality drawings. That's surprising, isn't it? Now wait. After all this talk about how extrinsic motivation is worse than intrinsic, you may think, why even bother with extrinsic motivation? While it is true that intrinsic motivation is better than extrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation can be a powerful tool when used alongside intrinsic motivation. Now, let's go back to that study real quick. I actually lied earlier. There were actually 3 groups. The third group started out the same as the no reward group, but after the time was up, they were given a surprise reward. The results during both rounds of the study for this third group was that they spent the most time drawing and made the best art out of all the groups. I think there are 2 things we should take away from the study in terms of games. 1. Surprise rewards can be super helpful in boosting fun and engagement with the game. 2. Extrinsic motivation is best used for long-term goals, like beating a challenge or reaching a milestone in the game. But if used too often, can be harmful to the player's fun and engagement. In short, use extrinsic motivation sparingly. Now you may have been asking, well, how does a game make intrinsic motivation? Or is it just luck? Well, I think it's about knowing what types of players will play your game, and knowing your game. You gotta know what type of players playing your game to know how to build your game around them. Like would they like tons of action, or more relaxed gameplay? You also need to know your game, like what is unique about it, what are the aspects of its genre, and probably more questions I can't think of. Let's take Subnautica as an example of making intrinsic motivation. One of the intrinsic motivations you might have is exploring. To motivate exploration, they left behind a breadcrumb trail all throughout the game, such as bigger oxygen tanks to go deeper, equipment and vehicles to go farther, and even a radiation suit to prompt you to try and aboard the Aurora. There are many more examples of breadcrumb trails they left throughout the game, but these are just a few. For the last part of this video, I want to cover some examples personal to me, and my intrinsic and extrinsic reasons for playing some games. Let's start off with one of my favorite games for the past 2 years, Foxhole. My intrinsic motivations to play Foxhole are winning the war, helping the war effort, having a great time with others, and being part of a community of thousands who all work together. Those are the main ones, but I have much more, such as the broad reasons for its generally fun gameplay. Some of my extrinsic motivations, interestingly, all fall within the logistics part of the game. Almost no one is intrinsically motivated to do the logistics in this game, so extrinsic rewards are given. I do logistics time to time for the extrinsic motivation of leveling up in the game, and more importantly, to rank up in the game. I play Call of Duty World at War mainly for its intrinsic value to me. It is one of my favorite games of all time because it has some of the best gameplay, story, and atmosphere of any game out there. But recently I had an extrinsic motivation to play this game, to get footage for a YouTube video I wanted to make. That's an important thing to note, that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can come from outside a game, while still being for a game. A good example of this is playing a game that you think is boring, but since you and some friends want to see who can get the highest score in it, you play it, an extrinsic motivation. Considering intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can be a very useful tool when designing games, considering what motivates people and how it's used. It's also opened my eyes to things in real life, and all the things I do and why I do them. I think this will also be a good tool for use in my future games, and when examining other games. Thanks for watching.